Today we're going to be talking about the stupidest bills that were proposed in Washington State's 2022 legislative session. And you won't believe some of these ideas that have been proposed. Thank you for watching. My name is Glen Morgan, and this is We the Govern. As we teased in the beginning, we are going to be talking about some of the stupidest pieces of legislation that were proposed in Washington State's 2022 legislative session. And unfortunately, there's a lot of those to choose from. But when we talk about the people who like to hurt us and who are proposing a lot of these ridiculous pieces of legislation, I'll be getting some of the specifics of the people who were involved in each of the different pieces of the bills, or the Senate bills, the House bills. However, all of them essentially involved these four people at some level of the process. First, starting with Governor Inslee, because pretty much nothing's going to happen in the legislature without his approval, or at least his acceptance moving forward. Speaker of the House, Lori Jenkins, who's in charge of the House side, obviously, and all these are Democrats, of course. And then Senate Leader Andy Billig, who is in charge of the Democrats on the Senate side, and the leader on the Senate. And then also AG Bob Ferguson, who really deserves special mention here, mostly for his effort to try to push bills that help people make it harder for them to defend themselves. He really does despise the Second Amendment, and that seems to be his key issue in life as he's moving forward, certainly as it applies to this legislative session. So when we're looking at the legislative session, it's always a great sigh of relief that most people have once the session is over. Now, because this is an election season and basically the legislative session tends to be two sessions. You have a long session in the odd number of years and a shorter session in the even number of years. And so that's because that the politicians like to have a little bit more time to run for office, and they can't campaign while they're in Olympia, basically finding ways to take more of your money and your freedoms and on the legislative session. So they want to make those years a little bit shorter. And so that's what we just came out of right now. Anytime the legislature is in session, your freedoms and your pocketbook are certainly not safe, and 2022 was no exception. Now, it's easy when somebody wants to come to Washington especially for the first time, and they realize just what a beautiful place this is. It doesn't matter if you're in Seattle looking at Mount Rainier in the distance, and it doesn't matter if you're out on the oceans, just enjoying a sunset. You're going to have any place you look in Washington. It's just a beautiful place. It's a wonderful place to visit, whether you're in the rainforest or even if you're out on the water just looking at the Olympic Mountains from Puget Sound. There are all kinds of just natural beauty everywhere you look. And it's easy for visitors to get caught up in that and fall in love with Washington. I mean, sometime in the distant past, 4 generations ago or so, in my family, that's what happened for me, and our family's been here ever since. So it's one of those situations where it's hard for sometimes people to recognize that despite how beautiful Washington State is, despite how much we love living in Washington, we have to recognize that the political process here is a heck of a lot uglier. And of course, that ugliness starts with Governor Inslee, who essentially is here functioning, filling that role of governor, mainly doing the bidding of whatever leftist agenda or grant grifting operations or whatever he's told to do by some of his billionaire supporters. The Democrat Party has a lot of billionaire supporters in the state, and whatever they tell him to do is essentially what they go and do. So Inslee is oftentimes trying to get direction and find out what he needs to do in order to retain his political power, or what he believes is his power. One thing that usually goes hand in hand with Inslee's day-to-day operations is just trying to find a way to extract more tax from the regular citizens. Inslee's done this ever since he lied about his 2012 election, said he wasn't going to tax Washingtonians, and then, of course, he broke that promise minutes after he got into the governor's office and immediately tried to jump on excuses for taxes. And that's just how he operates. There's no such thing as enough taxes. The world's not big enough, and there's not enough money in the world for government greed to feel like it's been satiated. They will continue to grow and bloat themselves as long as they can grab more and more resources from the people. That's just how they operate, and Inslee's no exception to that essential rule. So let's talk about one of these taxes that were proposed in a Senate bill, 5975, which is basically the transportation package that came up and created this massive and really a constitutional crisis fight between Washington State and all of its neighbors, Idaho to the east, Oregon to the south, and Alaska to the north. This is difficult to do. It doesn't really typically happen. Usually states aren't in total fights like this. And yet it appears that in Washington State, everybody on the Democrat Party side, because this only involved Democrat Party members, the Republicans were basically kept out of this process entirely. Basically, the Democrats decided to come up with this 6 cents per gallon state tax, where basically it's an export tax on fuel going into neighboring states. And this is because Washington State has several oil refineries here, and this was just another way to extract some cash, and it seemed to be, I don't know why they thought that was a really good idea, because the truth is the foundation of Washington, or of the American Constitution, had to do with when the Articles of Confederation failed, because states at the time were basically fighting each other, imposing excise taxes and all kinds of other restrictions, commerce restrictions on neighboring states, and that was leading to trade wars. And so the Constitution, when it was formed or created originally, was one of their attempts was to eliminate these types of trade wars between states. But of course, you shouldn't expect that any of the Democrats in either house, or certainly Governor Inslee's office, they have no idea about the constitutional history of America, and history is an incredibly weak subject for them, an inconvenient one at most. And certainly with Common Core education, you can't expect really any of their staffers to have a lot of education either, and a lot of these people come out of Evergreen State College. And so the fiasco of this proposal just escalated into a level of absurdity that we don't typically witness, even in Washington State. And Senator Mark Elias, who's head of the transportation committee, and he kind of was Inslee's spokesperson for this tax, when he came out on the radio and openly attacked Oregon Governor Brown, which is unusual because Governor Brown's a Democrat, Inslee's a Democrat, Elias is a Democrat, right? Everybody's kind of one big happy party. Usually they're on the same page with all kinds of bad ideas. For whatever reason, this one got personal, and Elias was really attacking Governor Brown. Governor Brown was attacking back, and Governor Brown looked like an adult in the room, and Elias and Inslee looked foolish. And so, of course, Elias had to come out and apologize, and essentially what happened is the only adult left in the Democrat caucus there, which was Representative Fay on the House side of the transportation, basically had to step in and get rid of that stupid 6 cent to excise tax and basically create a whole new approach for this bill. Now, it doesn't mean that I would agree with anything that Fay was doing here, but of course getting rid of that tax was kind of a requirement. Unfortunately, what it did is it created this transportation spending package which has been typical lately, was entirely unsustainable. There is no way the state can continue this escalation of massive spending. And of course it wastes a large percentage of it on foolish light rail projects, bike lanes to nowhere. Congestion relief is very rarely to be found in this package. And one of the strangest things that it does, and this has not been a typical thing that you'll see done by this bill, is that it swept all of the Public Works Trust Fund money. And the reason why that's significant is that typically these bills will come through and they say, okay, it's okay if we pass this bill because this is going to be in a dedicated fund and we're going to help this problem or that issue. We're going to help kids. We're going to help soft and cuddly rabbits, whatever the claim is. And it's really deceptive when they say that because those dedicated funds are meaningless. The legislature, every time it gets into a bind, and as they got into a bind during the transportation package this year, they decide just to sweep all of those funds and take them away for whatever squandering operation they're going to use. They're going to waste the money on some project. And that's what they did in this case. Now, unfortunately, this trust fund is actually useful because it is one of the few useful things they do in the transportation package because they use this money to match funds locally to rebuild bridges or real transportation projects in local governments. Usually cities and counties, they kind of match these funds, and it comes out of this trust account, and of course now the trust account's empty, which is kind of convenient because what the Democrats plan to do now is just come forward and blame the Republicans for it. They plan on doing that next year. Trust me, this is going to be what happens. They're going to come out and say, look, we were underfunding the trust fund account, and it's those terrible Republicans that did it, when in reality it was just basically this rapacious greed on the Democrat side for an unsustainable and ridiculous transportation package that they decided to sweep those funds along with every other tax dollar they could gobble up. So this was a foolish and ridiculous transportation bill. Usually they aren't quite this controversial, and that's what we ended up getting stuck with, just a real mess. Now, when we're talking about messes and we're talking about the Frankenstein bills, one of the bills that comes to mind during this last legislative session is House Bill 1099. And this is a bill that really primarily had to do with climate change and basically central planning, the Washington State's Growth Management Act, which is the state's version of central planning, putting excessive restrictions and kind of abusive regulatory formats using the Department of Ecology and environmental groups as a way to kind of abuse local communities all around Washington State and make it very difficult for people to utilize their land in an effective, efficient, and sustainable manner. That's really what the primary goal of the Growth Management Act has been from the beginning, and it's one of the reasons why your homes cost so much in the Pacific Northwest. So, because that bill apparently wasn't tough enough and the Growth Management Act hadn't been abusive enough, the environmentalists and a lot of other grant grifter operations wanted to add global warming issues in, climate change issues into it, and push additional regulatory pressure and more complication into this process. And this bill was sponsored by Representative Davina Dewar, and she's out of the 1st Legislative District. And this was kind of her bill here, and it also got involved with Lieutenant Governor Denny Heck, who is basically the Lieutenant Governor in Washington State, supervises the state Senate. And what happened is, in an unusual procedural move, the Republicans in the state Senate decided to ask for a scope and object ruling on this absurd bill, as it just got bloated and more ridiculous as it moved along. And what this means is that Lieutenant Governor Denny Heck was going to have to formally rule on whether or not this bill actually conformed to the rules and regulations that they have when they're proposing some of these bills, because a lot of shady stuff was going on here. Special interests were kicking in all kinds of ideas at the last minute. And so what he had to do, of course, is that Denny Heck's never going to really do what needs to be done, but he had to pretend like he cared, saying that he has two minds on the issue, but he's essentially just did Governor Inslee's bidding as predicted. However, in that whole process, it made this bill much more toxic as it moved forward. And essentially, the House Republicans killed this bill because legislative session has a hard end time unless the governor wants to extend the session, which Inslee did not this year. And so by debating and going on through the operating budget, it pushed this House Bill 1099 down the road too far, and it basically got killed by running out the clock, which is a legitimate procedural thing. Now, the Democrats are going to always claim that that's a filibuster, and of course, Dewar, not being the brightest legislator in the House, decided to run off the floor, didn't bother to even vote on the $65 billion bloated budget, the biggest budget in Washington State history. It's a biennial budget, so it's for 2 years. It's the biggest one ever, huge increase over the last 2-year budget, and despite that fact, she decided not to vote on it, ran off the floor, complained. It was a big drama. And of course, always blame the Republicans for it. In this case, I think the Republicans deserve some credit for killing an exceptionally poorly thought out, very foolish, and just entirely corrupt House Bill 1099. Now, there is no discussion of the 2022 legislative session that could possibly be complete without discussing Senate Bill 5078, which had to do with supposed high-capacity magazines. And this was kind of a big deal because this was one of Bob Ferguson's multiple-year effort to try to restrict the Second Amendment in Washington State as much as possible. There's nothing that's scarier to Democrats, or at least the Democrat elite leadership, than the fact that people might be able to defend themselves and use the Second Amendment to do so. And, of course, the more important thing is it looks good to the billionaire donors who largely support these Second Amendment bills that I've mentioned Nick Hanauer in the past, but also includes Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer and Michael Bloomberg back in New York. All these billionaires seem to really love this. It's not a grassroots movement to destroy people's ability to defend themselves, but it's certainly a billionaire movement in that effort. Of course, none of them are going to give up their armed security. And of course, if you want billionaire dollars to continue to flow into your political coffers, you need to placate them with at least occasionally a bill like this. So this was Bob Ferguson's bill that he pushed into the legislature, and there were a number of others. This is the only one that they really decided to go anywhere with that was really significant. Now, the other benefit that the Democrats have from this is that it's probably a moot bill anyway, because the same bill essentially is going before the Supreme Court out of California on a ruling that came out of there, and the Supreme Court's going to rule on this exact same subject. And it seems likely, most observers believe, that the high-capacity magazine restriction out of California is probably going to be thrown out, and essentially it's going to throw out Washington's as well. The other thing noteworthy about this is that this was the largest recorded opposition, formal opposition, to a bill ever in state history. 15,000 people, just shy of 15,000 people signed in opposed to it. And despite that, the Democrats, you could just see them put their head down and just hammer it through no matter what, ignore the people at all turns, which is pretty normal for them in Olympia. Now, of course, they, in the process, have now just sold more high-capacity magazines in Washington State than ever before, not the least because there's so many new gun owners who just don't have enough of them anyway, and the truth is, who could? So you might as well get a lot more now that they're going to put any kind of restrictions on it. So the Democrats have been great salespeople for firearms in Washington State. With this and the fact that they've also pushed defund the police efforts and helped drive up crime like never before in Washington. So a lot more people are deciding to take self-defense into their own hands since they can't trust government to do so. And it's galvanized gun owners now to recognize that they need to be engaged and involved in the political process. And of course, for the Democrats' perspective, they don't really solve the problem because it probably isn't going to last anyway, but it keeps their billionaire gravy train flowing into their campaign coffers. And for the Democrats, that's what's good enough, and that's the real politics behind this thing. And we'll see where it goes in this next session, but just a stupid and foolish bill, got a lot of attention around the country. However, as stupid and bad as that bill it didn't get as much negative publicity as House Bill 1692, which this is the bill that decriminalizes or reduces penalties anyway for drive-by shooting. Now, when I say drive-by shooting, I'm not talking about shooting with your camera. That's still illegal in Washington. They certainly don't want to touch your phone when you're driving. Those penalties remain. Nope. What this one does is this actually reduces penalties for violent drive-by shooting out of your car, shooting people and killing people from your car. It was a high priority for certain Democrats, it was a handful of them, that decided that they wanted to make sure those penalties were reduced. Because God help us if if people who are violent actually get put behind bars for being violent and doing terrible and horrible things. And drive-by shooting has had special penalties assigned to it for a long time. These guys said that was racist, which is really bizarre. I don't even think they actually read the bill, but this idea that was a racist, to have drive-by shooting penalties, that somehow was racist, as though there's a race-specific requirement and somebody decided to do something so terrible. I just, it's hard to explain the type of people that think bills like this are a good idea. Now, this bill did not go anywhere in the legislature. It was proposed exclusively by Democrats, aptly named Representative Hackney and Representative Simmons thought this was a good idea. They were the prime sponsors of the bill. And it did die in committee, didn't go anywhere, but it got national attention. I'll link to some of those articles down below. National attention and ridicule because the defund the police movement and the significant crime wave that's going on in Washington State, how in the world could this possibly help that? So wisely, it didn't go anywhere else. These guys got adequately ridiculed, although it's really never enough because if you're dumb enough to think these are good ideas, just think of what else these people are putting in. And it's seriously, there's just no thought behind some of these bills, and that was one that definitely got a lot of attention. So then one of the bigger questions that came, of course, in this legislative session is anybody going to put any kind of restraint on the out-of-control, endless, never-ending, multi-year state of emergency now that Governor Inslee has been enjoying since early 2020? I mean, it's absurd. 2 years. Now, the 2 weeks to flatten the curve has become 2 years to flatten the economy and to trash as many people's lives as possible. Inslee seems to be thriving in this environment, and so there was some recognition, especially with this red wave pushing into the communities, that maybe we have to do something and put a little bit of guardrails around the situation that we see here. So Senate Bill 5909 was essentially a Senate compromise option on two different bills that had been proposed in the House. House Bill 1029, which Representative Walsh from the 19th Leg District proposed, which was a 14-day restriction on any state of emergency without the legislature getting together and voting on it, and kind of a milder version, House Bill 1772, that put a 30-day restriction, and this was proposed by Republican Representative Corey. It did have some At least one Democrat signed on with it, one of the Democrats likely to be threatened under the current 2022 election wave going on right now. And so Senate Bill 5909 was just this compromise option. Now, what set the stage for this bill is that there had been a long floor fight on what was called House Bill 1837. It's an ergonomic standards bill. And I know that doesn't sound like there's anything to do with this bill, but what it did is it demonstrated the Republicans were willing, towards the end of the legislative session, to really go down to the wire and procedurally fight on some of these bills. And this particular long floor fight went from 9 p.m. until 6:30 a.m. the next day. And that sent a message to Speaker Jenkins that the Republicans were serious and that they were going to actually engage on some of these more ridiculous and foolish bills. So when Senate Bill 5909 was introduced at 1 a.m., 4 days before the end of session, if this was so important, of course, Democrats would have proposed it earlier, but they wait until the last minute, proposed it at 1 a.m., and the Republicans were getting ready to, ramp up. They're going to have another long floor session debate. And instead, she pulls it after 30 minutes and cancels her media availability for a few days. And then, of course, when she did finally get in front of the media, she blamed the Republicans. Because that's how it goes. This is how Washington state politics, especially in 2022 right now, that's how it goes. No matter what, when the Democrats fail in their efforts, and it's not like the Democrats really wanted to constrain Inslee's endless emergency powers, they seem to enjoy it. But nevertheless, that's where we're at. So now Inslee gets to keep the emergency going thanks to Speaker Jenkins and help from Democrats in the legislature. Even this very watered-down version was too much for them, and they certainly didn't want to talk about it much. So using any excuse they could just to keep Inslee in eternal emergency, even though he's lifted a lot of the mandates, that seems to be the current political approach going on. Now, all of this is happening behind this, with this backdrop of this red wave coming. Even in Washington State, anybody that spent any time working in communities with real people, which means nobody in the state legislature, but actually people out in there who are trying to make a living right now with incredibly high cost of living, inflation, radical increases in fuel costs, food costs, and then this escalating crime wave, this homeless absurdity with the homeless industrial complex, dumping camps and druggies everywhere in all the communities, and then the destruction of the public education system by Chris Reichel. All these things are generally creating a substantial wave across the community in places I don't even think most of the Republican establishment of either party recognize. Now, you can never underestimate the ability of the Republicans to screw up and snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. So regardless of the red wave that appears to be coming, the Republicans are certainly capable of screwing this up. They're going to need candidates that don't need drool cups if they're going to be taking them out on the campaign, trying to campaign with these people and trying to win office. They need to have good candidates out there and competitive candidates who are serious about running for office and who don't believe that somehow they're just going to get through because there's suddenly a wave. Nevertheless, a wave certainly makes it easier to ride in and attain political office, and I think that the Republicans have the opportunity to take advantage of this. Secondly, the Democrats are clearly trying to do everything they can to hurt as many people as they can in Washington State, and they can't seem to help themselves. This support of this crime wave and instituting policies that clearly are destructive to normal people in the state and only seem to reward these grant-grifting operations or these political insiders, I don't think that that's going to play well for them. But nevertheless, the Republicans still can't take anything for granted, neither should anybody else. And what people who live in Washington know that this is a place worth fighting for. It's beautiful here. It's wonderful. It's a great place to raise a family. It's a great place to live. It's a great place to grow up. I'm fifth generation Washingtonian, and my kids are sixth generation. I want to stay here and fight. I'm not going anywhere. And there's just so much beauty around us and so many amazing things here, whether you're watching snow geese fly in front of Mount Baker or whether you're even in Seattle, if you've been able to survive the homeless camps, the druggies, and the crime, and you're able to just enjoy the city. It's still a beautiful place, and there's a lot of opportunities there. Seattle could be cleaned up. It really is possible. As long as you get rid of some of the crazy political people there right now, it is very possible to clean it up. And when you look around the state, the daffodil fields in Skagit County, just all over, it's worth fighting here. It is really worth making a difference. Snoqualmie Falls, just all kinds of visibly wonderful places to visit and wonderful places to recognize that there's a lot of value in the state that needs to be defended. It just can't be thrown away because we have ridiculous political people in leadership positions today. Yet it's hard to see through the fog, to see that beauty sometimes. It's easy to be covered up by clouds, and it's just difficult to necessarily navigate through that process for a lot of people. But if you stay focused, if you're willing to thread the needle and stay focused on what your objective is, which hopefully is to clean up the state, hopefully to make it a better place. That's what we're all striving and working towards. And I think sometimes we just have to recognize that it isn't about us. It isn't about the situation that we find ourselves today. It's not even about these ridiculous political people that need to be removed and the bloated bureaucracy that they've developed that's then created that needs to be resized down to be a much more manageable place. It's really about future generations. This is a fight worth engaging because for freedom and liberty to survive, for future generations to have a possibility of living in the same joy and wonder that many of us have grown up in the state, we have to recognize that we have to stay engaged and involved in the political process. It won't happen on its own. No wave is going to necessarily save you. It requires us to be engaged. So if you want to learn more, please feel free to go to wethegovern.com. And if you want to get some more details, I've linked to quite a few of them down below. Please add your comments down below as well if you want to add bills that I've missed. There's plenty that I did miss. There's things that would be worth talking about. And maybe I can cover those in an additional video in the future. And just please remember that you need to be engaged because the truth is, the future belongs to those who show up.